it's okay. I think I'm just going to use the hair.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move this down for a second so it doesn't hide my face. As a short person, you always have to be aware of that, you know. So let me take just one quick second to say that this is my first CASETA experience, and so far it has been wonderful. I want to thank the staff and everyone who's been in touch with me in planning this and helping arrange my travel and all of that. I just am thrilled to be here and really humbled and honored. I also want to thank someone who's not here with us, but here with us in many ways, maybe not physically, and that's Michael Grauer at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. He's been a mentor to me. I work often with him, but also walking through the Texas Arts Fair here, I would not know a lot of those artists and love them if it weren't for Michael, because he's been collecting at the Panhandle Plains a lot of those people. So I feel like they're near and dear to my heart in a way that wouldn't exist if it weren't for him. The other thing I wanted to say is I'm proud that the Panhandle is represented here well. Carol Lovelady, the director of the Panhandle Plains, has also made her way here, so be sure to stop and talk to her. So I don't know if the Panhandle is Texas or the real Texas or what, but sometimes it gets forgotten, or like people want to say it's Western Oklahoma, you know, so whatever. But we're here. Okay, so I will get started. I was really interested in the mandate here of being one of the opening speakers for CASETA. So thinking of O'Keeffe as a Texas artist, so I better well prove to you that she was in fact a Texas artist, right? But then I thought about the amount of time she actually spent in Texas, and it's quite short. It's 37 months or 3 years, basically between 1912 and 1918, when she was between 26 and 30 years old, so she was quite young. And she wasn't there only or exclusively during that time. She was rather nomadic in those years, moving between Texas and Virginia, or Texas and New York. And before she was 30, she had lived in all of the starred locations on the map. So let's do some math. 3 years spent in Texas divided by 98 years of life. It's not a very high percentage. But you'll notice on this map that Texas was the first place that she lived in the American West. And her time in Texas was the revelatory moment when she realized that America was much bigger, much more inspiring than she had realized. Indeed, she writes and speaks of finding the real America out there in Texas. And because of this, her introduction to the West through Texas was much more profound for her life and art than that 3% reflects. So I'm absolutely going to argue today that O'Keeffe is a Texas artist. In those years, in the 1910s, and in particular her years spent teaching at my current institution, West Texas A&M University, which was then West Texas State Normal College, she was incredibly productive in her creative responses to her Texas experiences. My book, Georgia O'Keeffe Watercolors, 1916 to 1918, is all about this. So if you will let me use a prop. I brought the book. So what we have here is the book. It's large size. What they did, the Radius Press are the people who are responsible for this. They're out of Santa Fe. They beautifully color matched all of her watercolors from her Texas years, and in full color, full size format. So even when it's bigger than the page, there's fold out formats. The other thing that they did, and I love showing this, so you have the book jacket, but if you remove the book jacket, what you see is that they've printed one of her most beautiful Evening Star series across the book binding and put the title on the back, a kind of audacious design element that I think really corresponds to O'Keeffe's own kind of innovative design. The other thing about the book, it's just released for a second edition. So they sold out the first edition, which was a limited edition press run, but they decided to open it back up. And the essay is a removable packet that you can then read the text corresponding to all of the images, and you can see them collected here. So, and I'm not making money on this book, so I feel like I can like very openly promote it. What it is a nonprofit press that usually does contemporary artists' art books. And art books, we know, are not money makers. So what they do with any money that they make is put it into the next project. But funny story is that they usually work with living artists. And when they pitched the George O'Keeffe book to the board members said to David Chickie, who's the editor-in-chief at Radius, "You know she's dead, right?" And what his response was that he wanted to focus on her when she was still an up-and-coming artist in her young years. So they bought it, and they've now done a second press run, so you can get it on Amazon or at George O'Keeffe Museum. So in Texas, O'Keeffe became the experimental and determined abstractionist that made her the famous artist we know today, and one who is deserving of her own museum in Santa Fe. Now, while she was living in Texas, O'Keeffe had her first solo show in New York City in April 1917. She was interestingly described and promoted by her dealer and her future husband, Alfred Stieglitz, as one of the truest, the most real American artists he represented. And she was interestingly touted by him as being from Canyon, Texas. Not the East Coast, not European trained, raw, an example of true American creative grit. But what else happened on the national and international scale in April 1917? America entered World War I. And because of this declaration of war, O'Keeffe's solo show was the very last show in that famous space of Stieglitz's 291. The gallery closed permanently shortly after her works were taken off the walls. It was no longer sustainable during the war. We even have an issue of Stieglitz's art and photography magazine camera work that he sent to O'Keeffe in Texas, which was also the last issue of this pivotal publication of modernism. In the dedication he wrote to her, Stieglitz refers to O'Keeffe as, quote, "the little girl of the Texas plains," end quote. That "of" is important there. He also calls himself the old man of 291. He was indeed much older than she was by more than 30 years. But what this dedication asserts is that in Stieglitz's eyes, O'Keeffe was a Texas artist, an identity he admired and cultivated for her. She was a Texas artist as much as she was a Wisconsin artist, her birthplace, a Virginia artist, where her parents settled, a New York artist, where she studied and settled with Stieglitz after their marriage in 1924, or a New Mexico artist, where she began spending part of each year in 1929, moved permanently after Stieglitz's death, and where she died in 1986. I don't want to overstate her Texasness, if that's a thing, but I do want to assert the import of this identity for O'Keeffe, which isn't just a starry-eyed dream of us Texans who want to claim her. For this talk, I want to draw on my research for the Watercolors book, but I also want to expand my conclusions. Today, I aim to take a new approach to O'Keeffe as a Texas artist and to foreground, in addition to her inspiration from Texas landscapes and people, her experiences in art as inflected by World War I. These years shaped O'Keeffe for the rest of her life, but O'Keeffe can also be seen as a kind of case study for American identity during the war. What was actually happening to young people in those years, and how were they feeling about it? She was herself one of those young people on the home front in Texas, and we can learn from her written and visual responses to this complex situation in American history. Now, what I'm going to do is show you quotes from letters that she wrote. I will always read them aloud to you, so you don't have to scramble to read if I do a setup. So just relax, and I will be kind of performing the O'Keeffe letters, if you will. So she writes, "War is killing the individual in it, unless he has learned livingness. If he had it, he wouldn't be a good soldier. Art never seemed so worthwhile to me before. I have a million things to do, must paint too, must write too. I'm on the warpath at such mad speed." She taught at a college where her male students were leaving for war, where her female students were taking classes on canning and on ways women could contribute to the war, and where Texas patriotism among the college community was strong and thick. Her own brother, Alexei, was in training as a soldier in 1917, and she visited him in Waco at Camp MacArthur, where he was stationed in late November 1917. She got news of him being shipped off for Europe in January 1918 when she herself was gravely ill and became unable to cover her teaching schedule, and then learned that his ship had sunk outside of Ireland in February 1918, right before she left Canyon for, guess where, San Antonio, to recuperate and focus on her health in a more mild climate than the Panhandle. And we can see that contrast here. In the left image, she's showing you a Panhandle snowstorm that has put snow upon a neighboring house. That snow to her was pink, but it still has a dryness and aridness that you can feel compared to the pieces that she did on the right, which she completed in San Antonio, that have humidity, greenness, lushness, and even a kind of tropical Mexican inspiration with the colors. So you can see that shift. She always responds to wherever she finds herself. You can see this climate contrast even in the works that she completed between Canyon and San Antonio. In other words, what I'm thinking about now is reading O'Keeffe's Texas art as a response to wartime fears and challenges, even while it was also unarguably a celebration of Texas beauty. And this, I hope, offers what is a fresh perspective on some of her most beloved early work. Now, what did Texas mean to O'Keeffe? Before she got there, she was already enamored with the Wild West myths of Texas. She writes, and this is in her autobiography published in 1976, "Texas had always been a sort of faraway dream. When we were children, my mother read to us every evening and on Sunday afternoons. I had listened for many hours to boys' stories of the Wild West, of Texas, Kit Carson, and Billy the Kid. It had always seemed to me that the West must be wonderful. There was no place I knew of that I would rather go. So when I had a chance to teach there, off I went to Texas, not knowing much about teaching." So what did she find when she first arrived? Having gotten a choice job as supervisor of drawing and penmanship at the brand new Amarillo City Public School System, making more money than she would have back east, never mind that her credentials were somewhat forged or misrepresented, she showed up at one of the 6 train stations in Amarillo. The town had become a major railroad crossroads and cattle shipping hub of the Southwest by that time. She expected to find a dusty pioneer town of the Wild West novels that she had read as a girl, and found instead a still dusty but up-and-coming city. Cable cars, paved streets, an opera house, and even mansions being constructed down the road from her lodgings. And yet, living in the Magnolia Hotel versus the boarding houses where other unwed teachers resided, O'Keeffe came in contact with some rough-and-tumble cowboys right off the range, and even supposedly witnessed a shootout on the street in front of the hotel. Welcome to Texas, Georgia, where you're more likely to go to the pen for stealing a cow than for killing a person. And that might still be true, I'm not sure. But was she a Texas artist yet? I would argue no, or at least we don't have evidence for that claim. Here are some of her extant pieces that are dated from the Amarillo years, which have no real provable tie to Texas people or landscapes. And we have no idea if she made them in Texas or elsewhere because she traveled often between Texas and New York or Virginia. So when and how does she become a Texas artist? She was clearly an abstractionist before she made her way west. Her Blue Lines was a work that she completed in South Carolina that Stieglitz in New York apparently hung on his office door and proclaimed that he had finally found the American abstract artist he had been looking for. Now, comparing this to Number 20 Special, a work that she did complete in Texas, we can see several correlations. Shapes and forms used as an expressive language without obvious narrative content. A bold and confident juxtaposition of positive and negative space, of foreground and background. A distinctly asymmetrical balance, and a command of her mark making. The title, Number 20 Special, likewise refers to no objective content. We only know that it's special, and that is the 20th attempt at something. What the title doesn't tell you, though, is that the something special was Texas, and the Palo Duro Canyon, to be specific, which O'Keeffe totally fell in love with. In letter after letter, she talks about visiting the canyon with friends, hiking, taking in its beauty. She writes, "I climbed and scrambled about till I was out of breath many times over and felt very little. Such a tiny little part of what I could see had worn me out. Yes, I was very small and very puny and helpless, and all around was so big and impossible. It seemed as if the steep places, the faraway parts, the ragged little cedars and uncertain stones all laughed at me for attempting to get over any of it." She also explores the forms of the canyon in line and color. Here, though, she is being playful. She has inverted the reds and greens. The rounded red forms below are inspired by the bulbous, squatty, rugged, naturally dark green cedar or juniper trees that grow in the canyon, while the form of glowing green cliff face in the distance is based on the reddish earthen cliff walls of Palo Duro. She played similar color games with her later works made in New Mexico, such as the series based on a cow pelvis bone that she collected. What was first blue sky, seen through white bone, became yellow distant space, seen through red bone. Now, can we see the buildup to number 20 special similar to these two pelvis works that go from more direct naturalism toward an increased abstraction? Yes, I think we can. We have a graphite drawing where we see the linear cliff faces sweeping up on the right and the circular forms of trees below. We have a more finished charcoal piece where the rear cliff face begins to glow and the rounded forms look almost like champagne bubbles or lunar craters. This piece even inspired a photographic portrait by Stieglitz of his beloved O'Keeffe just after she had moved back to New York City in 1918. He captures her in front of this charcoal drawing of the canyon, but he crops out the telling details of the Texasness of the image to show its raw abstraction. And yet we know, and O'Keeffe knew, that this portrait is all about being a Texas artist. We have another graphite drawing where we can see her struggling to get the forms down on the page. We see eraser marks or smudges in the upper right. We see the more obvious mesa quality of the landforms. This was an artist that didn't do things haphazardly. She worked hard through her ideas. She also, remember, said that art never seemed more worthwhile to her than it did right then. She works hard at her art even during the war. She even compares her own working method to the warpath, which I think shouldn't go unnoticed. She says she had to do art, and she did. Now here we see in the red landscape, this is from the Panhandle Plains Museum, we see her struggling with her oil technique. She was already incredibly adept with watercolor, like those blue lines, but oil wasn't her forte yet. This painting is lumpy. The PPHM, Panhandle Plains, has in fact turned it into a 3D painting that was unveiled just this past week for the visually impaired. It's called Art for Everyone. And they hope to be able to allow people, visually impaired and non, to feel what O'Keeffe saw and to create a tactile object. And this painting, I would argue, might be the only O'Keeffe worth feeling because of its lumpiness, right? It mimics the canyon walls itself in its undulating structure, unlike her entirely flat watercolors in her Texas years and her oils later, which she really thins out and makes a harder edge. But what this work does too is it gets at the kind of emotional, even spiritual inspiration she found in the Texas canyon lands. The passionate redness, the red-bloodedness she writes about loving and certain people that she met on the plains, a redness that isn't literal because of the canyon walls. They are more orange or terracotta, but rather here a subjective inner redness. In other paintings, she explores that range of reds further, like these two, where red mesa glows a hot, translucent orange red, and Canyon with Crows shifts from the natural terracotta rock walls to a hot pink and purple cliff in the distance. When she moves to New Mexico, she doesn't newly discover those red cliffs that she continues to paint. She goes looking for them because she found them first in Texas. And while in our great state, she even paints her own body as a pinkish red over and over again, comparing in letters her bodily redness to the Texas canyon landscapes. In red landscape, the one on the left, the red and green balance here is more naturalistic than in number 20 special, with the cliff faces being the reds and the bulbous greens as the trees. But that burst of color and light in the upper right, it could be her response to those amazing Texas plains sunsets. Or it could be an imagined celestial event full of hope and passion, or the beauty of what comes after living. She wrote about that. She used that very phrase to describe the sublime, even heavenly plains. But could it also equally evoke, for us, for her, a frightful flash of an exploding artillery shell in the trenches of Belgium and France? Like any great abstractionist, O'Keeffe doesn't give us the answers. She allows us to guess and surmise and play with ideas here. It can be all of these things. Surely it represents something bigger than ourselves, something both inspiring and terrifying, overwhelming at the same time. The other thing about red landscape is its sophisticated balance around a radial axis of symmetry like a pinwheel. And the best way to see this is to turn it upside down. I learned this trick from Dale Cronkrite, who is the head conservator at the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, who told me that this painting, while he was doing conservation on it for our 2016 summer show that included her Texas works, he told me that this painting quickly became one of his favorites. And it was when he got it in his lab and saw it upside down. He told me that this painting was the evidence that O'Keeffe knew the potential of her own powers of design even as early as her Texas years. And this was a woman who later, and we have evidence of this too, she would be on an airplane, take a napkin, make 3 lines that represented a tree or a river, go back to her studio, transfer those 3 lines from the small napkin to the giant canvas without projection, and you could digitally overlay them and they're exactly the same. She had an eye for design, not just for color. Another amazing red-based design is her Evening Star series, including this one in the neighboring Museum of the McNay here in San Antonio. For her, the design showed hell let loose like a fried egg. She writes, "Been painting in my spare time. It's big and it looks like hell let loose with a fried egg in the middle of it. And I'm crazy about it anyway. I feel as though I've burst and done something I hadn't done before. The sister is liking it very much. Her sister Claudia was living with her and attending West Texas at the time. Oh, it's great to feel full of work again. It's terribly red and such fun." But this series is about Texas too. The plains in the evening at dusk when you can see the brightness of Venus and how it connects you to bigger ideas like heaven and hell. These are among her most beautiful Texas abstractions, completed just before America's declaration of war. But as we also know, she was already thinking about the reality of fighting coming to America's and her own doorstep. That same month, March 1917, she writes to Stieglitz that she was reading the book Why Men Fight in her spare time. So as much as I want to read the dramatic beauty of the Texas evening sky into this image, I also want to read tension, apprehension, and anxiety. These things pushed her to create as much as the nature that she saw. Again, remember how she says never has art been so important as it is now. It was how she made sense of her world. So we've seen that O'Keeffe is a Texas artist drawing inspiration from the canyon lands and the skies. What else screams Texas? Cattle and ranching, right? Does she depict cattle in her Texas years? She does a whole series of cow skulls, but they don't begin until her time in New Mexico from 1929 on. She actually shipped a whole barrel of cow skulls from New Mexico back to New York City so she could continue to work on them from her New York studio. But as far as we know, she never did a cow skull in her Texas years. So are these cow skulls Texas art? I would argue yes, they are. She describes in an interview later in her life how these skulls were directly related to her discovery of the cattle industry when she lived in Amarillo, Texas, and how they represented the real America for her. She writes, "I had lived in the cattle country. Amarillo was the crossroads of cattle shipping, and you could see the cattle coming in across the range for days at a time. For goodness sake, I thought, the people who talk about the American scene don't know anything about it. So in a way, that cow skull was my joke on the American scene, and it gave me pleasure to make it in red, white, and blue." But did she ever paint actual cattle in Texas? She wrote about them all the time, how they looked like a lace edge of a garment as they walked along the ridge of the canyon, for instance. Perhaps we can see in her work Sunrise with Little Clouds 1 and 2 as showing hints of cattle in the distance. I put 2 here first because it's available to the public at the George O'Keeffe Museum, while number 1 is still in private collection and its location is unknown. If any of you own this painting, please come find me. We were not even able to find it to rephotograph it for the volume, so we're sort of on the lookout for it. So what she does, though, is she talks about admiring the cowboys and the cattle. She writes, "I'm sitting on the porch. It's a warm, sunny afternoon. Cowboys went by with a bunch of horses a little while ago, a bunch of cows and calves going by now." She also goes to the county fair and finds the bodies of the cows beautiful. And she talks about the stench of the feedlots and the holding pens. She was in the thick of cattle country, and she knew it, and she loved it. But from O'Keeffe, we also learned that cattle in America was a foil for the trauma and fear of war. For Ted Reed, a student at the Normal College, and a man that O'Keeffe cared about deeply, she even considered marrying him at one point and becoming a rancher's wife. Did you know that about her? Yeah. Cattle was home for Ted, and his ranch was an escape from being a soldier. So O'Keeffe describes this in the lower left. Ted thinks maybe he will go down on the Rio Grande and be a river guard, would rather do that than just be a straight run-along soldier, has a ranch and cattle down there. In another letter, she describes how it was also work that Ted needed to do and that he didn't have time for war. She writes, "Ted is a nice boy. No, that's not the way to say it. I like him," says it's better. "He is one kind of cowboy. Thinks he can't go to war right now because he has a lot of cattle down on the ranch that they have to keep through the summer." Now, while Ted and Georgia lay together underneath the sunsets like we see in these 2 paintings, they shared a deep appreciation for Texas beauty. But they were also thinking about their futures, their options in a time of war. What could they look forward to? Fighting or ranching, combat or marriage, death or life? The date of this letter penned by O'Keeffe is also key. May 1917, 1 month after the war became very, very real for these young people in Texas. But not only does cattle and ranching become a foil for war and fighting, it also gives O'Keeffe a metaphor for the meat market of the American military. She described and questioned why the older generations in Canyon sent their youth off to war like sending the cattle to market, while they stayed behind with their cars and their despicable selves. This comparison could not be more Texas. The cattle market was the source of power there. It wasn't the cattlemen and ranch owners who were being shipped off to Europe. It was their sons or their cowhands. While the owners made money on their cattle and drove their cars around the home front, young people like Ted were being forced into fighting for something far away, unreal, and terrifying. Now remember, the trains were also a way to get goods and services and people and cattle in and out of Canyon. She did a number of works that interpreted the Canyon trains. You see 2 of them here. But remember, the trains were also the way to ship the soldiers to their camps and then ultimately to the battlefront. Now, I bring this in because I didn't want to forget to tell you about this, but we did do a 2016 show that corresponded with the Watercolors book. It was at the O'Keeffe Museum, and it brought together all of her Texas watercolors and oils like the Red Landscape in one place for a few months. And I took students there, because I teach art history at West Texas, and my students are taking a photograph of those 2 trains, one that lives in New York and one that lives in Amarillo, and they were side by side again. It was like a homecoming. It was very beautiful. So she writes, "It's the older folks I cannot stand, the talk of men past 30. Yeah, I think that's funny. And she's 30, right? So she's on the cusp between these 2 people. The women and the men. So then she writes, girls and boys and the ones who must fight are different." Okay, so she's talking about her students there. Now, cattle from the Texas plains also lingered with O'Keeffe long beyond her Texas years, not only in naturalistic imagery like the cow skulls, but also in sound image abstractions too. This work is inspired not by what the cattle looked like, either up close or far away, but what they sounded like. She writes, "As I opened the door, I heard cattle, many, in the pens over by the track, lowing. I wonder if you ever heard a whole lot of cattle lowing. It sounds different here too, just ground and sky. And the lowing cattle you hardly see, either them or the pens. The pens are of weather-beaten boards, take on the color of the ground, it seems. I like it and I don't like it. It's like music. I made up a tune to it this morning. So lowing cattle sound, she likes it and doesn't like it. But might we also compare that sharp saw blade edge to the trauma that she was experiencing as she empathized with those young soldiers being shipped off like cattle, almost picturing them lowing too. Music, but also pain and sadness. She writes, everything worn, I can't get enough of it, and still it almost drives me crazy. I'm not at all certain that my feeble mind has been able yet to center on anything that would make me willingly offer my life, if the excitement and adventure were taken out of it. Here she can't imagine giving her life for the cause of war, but at the same time as a woman on the home front in Texas, she seems slightly envious of the excitement and adventure of war, something she can only think about from a distance while she tries to keep getting up in the morning and doing her teaching work and making her art as if things were normal. In this work, again from the McNay here in San Antonio, made more than 30 years after hearing those cows in Texas, she's still painting that auditory memory. But with this piece, the intensity of her sound memory has peaked, burst, exploded with the use of yellows and reds. Now the question here is, could she also be connecting that lowing cattle memory to memories about the war? The colors certainly seem as traumatic as they do warm and inviting. Was this memory positive or negative for her, or both? I like it, I don't like it. As her Texas years surely were, they were both wonderful and awful at the same time. And on that note, does this comparison go too far? Can we see the same exploding light, bursts of emotions, possibly triggered by her complex feelings about life during the Great War? In addition to cattle, what other Texas motifs did O'Keeffe paint? This watercolor, with its minimal palette, shows her responding to the West Texas surroundings, windmills, water towers, flat horizons, and big skies. The letter written to Stieglitz also describes the dusty landscape and windy weather that made faces a ruddy red in the Panhandle. Quote, the dance was lots of fun. I don't know exactly why, but it was more fun than usual. It was great to see Ted, his face very red, outdoors all the time, 75 miles to get here. Faces turn a wonderful color from sun and wind here, his eyes so shining. I've actually seen this work in person at the O'Keeffe Museum, and it's pinker than it looks here. That pinkish, dusty air filling the sky is exactly what she captures in her letter and her painting. In another letter, she mentions eating some of that dust and how it creates substantial chewing. We also learned that in Texas she was socializing, living her life, dancing, and that students were coming across the vast distances of the Texas prairie to attend school at West Texas State Normal. But what else do we learn from this quote? The conclusion here reads, not exactly happy. War, everything's a turmoil, grabbed my hand right tight, dancing. Its conclusion hesitates to be fully happy or joyful, to entirely appreciate the colors of the landscape or the people at a dance. She almost feels guilty that she's enjoying herself at the time, knowing that her dance partners could disappear into the trenches and perhaps never return, or even return but be forever changed. In one letter, after she had left Canyon for San Antonio in February 1918, she describes running into a student who had joined the Army. Quote, we went to the bank, and while we stood in line, I turned round, and there was Frank Day, Lieutenant Day, one of our Canyon Army boys. He almost stood on his head. It was great to see how excited he was, and changed, though still the same. Now back to those Texas skies again. Here are two versions, one of the night sky with a grid pattern of star holes where the pigment is absent, and the naked paper creates the illusion of faraway glowing bodies. The other is one of a series of 3 pictures, each of the sunrise as it occurs on the plains, as it unfolds in time, the washing of color, together mimicking the way light slowly emerges daily on the horizon, playing through the air and space like a dance of veils. In both, the horizon is starkly rendered by a thin line of blank paper, which her incredible control of the paint kept free from color. Just after she moved to Canyon in the fall of 1916, she wrote about how the country in Texas was all sky. She writes, "The country is almost all sky, and such wonderful sky, and the wind blows hard, and the sun is hot, the glare almost blinding, but I don't care, I like it." It's interesting then to compare this letter in 1916 to one she wrote in November 1917, after the country had spent more than 6 months at war. She writes, "The outdoors comes nearer bringing me to life, making me feel something. It feels the first life I've felt in ages. The plains are wonderful, mellow-looking, dry grass, the quiet and the bigness of it. Anything that makes you feel quiet and bigness like that is marvelous. Wouldn't it be great in a person? Why can't I make it into shapes? I wish I could want to try." Here we see her verging on depression, self-doubt, worthlessness. In those years, as often as she raves about the beauty of nature or the good humor of her students, she writes of being unsure, confused, of wanting to end it all. Suicidal talk. It's really kind of gripping. She also writes about being lost in thought about the war. What's the use? As usual, the things you said about the war today were almost exactly what I'd been thinking. This morning, almost forgot to finish lacing my shoe. Sitting here pulling on the strings, thinking about the war. And yet, her work was something that kept her going. It was hard to concentrate, it was hard to get work done, but she kept at it, it kept her going. Now here she writes about that. This is one of the photographs from Le Mirage, which is the yearbook of the faculty at Chapel at West Texas State Normal, and she writes, "The work, I like that too. You know, I get such a ridiculous lot out of living myself, and these boys and girls from the plains get a lot out of it too, but I believe I can help them to get more, to get something they don't get now. I like them like the country, and it's absurd the way I like to work in it." I'm returning here to the flag painting, which she likely did in Texas, but after she left Canyon, so in spring of 1918. This painting isn't exactly America's flag. Its surface patterning has been obscured, but the colors of the work are clearly red, white, and blue, evoking patriotism even while showing its amorphousness, its lack of being a clear or single universal response to war. I also noticed for the first time in preparing for this talk that the lines on the painting, which I always took to mean telecommunication lines, phone, telegraph, now start to read like railroad tracks. There are 3 lines, not 2, but she does the same 3 stark lines to resemble the railroad tracks into Canyon in her train painting that's from the Amarillo Museum of Art. Remember the trains that took her student soldiers away from Canyon to their training stations or posts overseas, transported them like cattle, which was also loaded onto those trains and shipped to market? The train here is the promise of her own travel. She took the train back to New York City in June 1917 to see her own solo show in 291. She went to Colorado on vacation that summer, and she saw New Mexico for the first time from a train car. But it's also a machine of war. The complexity emerges again. Being patriotic, O'Keeffe seems to claim in her flag painting, just like being an American, is layered, complex, challenging. World War I was a time where America asserted itself as a nation on the international stage. General Pershing refused to let his troops be commanded by French or English officers. Rather, America was an independent sovereign nation that would command its own troops and never waver from that policy. That independent gumption is similar to the kind of fight O'Keeffe was doing as an independent woman artist out in the American West. I'm interested in that comparison. But it was also a time when Americans were struggling on the battlefront and the home front on how to be patriotic. O'Keeffe's letters reflect this very clearly. She writes, in April 1917, she wondered how she could support the war effort, saying she couldn't simply clap and wave a flag. She wondered, what's the use in art if there is war? Remember when she said there's nothing more important than art in war? Like, that's the conflict. But then, after she visited her brother Alexei in officer training in Waco in November 1917, she changes her attitude entirely. She says, "It seems as though I never feel more on my own 2 good feet than I ever have in my life before. I hope they don't dampen me completely the minute I get off the train in Canyon. I didn't want to come home, but I feel as though I have lots to do, lots, and one thing to paint. It's the flag, and I see it floating. I will leave you with one final statement by O'Keeffe as my conclusion. She writes, everything war, and I can't get enough of it. I wish for a thing so tremendous and terrible as what is happening, I might put my hand on some cause and desired result that I could feel definitely justifies it all, but I hunt all around. It's like chasing an almost invisible slippery nut. Small, slippery, hard to crack, slippery. Everything contradicts the other. This statement reminds me how even when we search for utter certainty and complete clarity about art, war, patriotism, or what it means to be an American, we often search in vain. Those notions are complicated, not singular, but in that complication, like O'Keeffe, we can find inspiration, creativity, productivity, and community. She found all those things in Texas, things I believe we can all agree that we still need in America today. So we can surely learn about Texas from O'Keeffe, the Texas artist, but we can also gain some valuable perspectives on American identity, even or especially in times of war. Thank you. I think there's time for Q&A. Is this true? Okay. Does anybody have a question? Well, I must have done a good job then, huh? Oh, yes.
Over the years, there's been a good deal of discussion about who brought modernism to Texas. It seems to me that your presentation answered that. Would you agree?
Oh, wow. I don't want to be the one quoted as saying that, but I mean, the early date of her presence here, I think, is worthy of note, right? 1910s, that's early. And so, yes, maybe. I think she at least gets partial credit. Other questions? Let me see. I think my mic, let me take this one off. Okay, there. Did you hear? Is everyone okay for the last answer? I said partial credit, hedging. Tricky. Yes?
I'm interested in her time in San Antonio.
You're interested in her time in San Antonio?
Yes, and
yes.
Debts and all that.
That is another area that needs more attention. In the book, the Watercolors book, you'll see a reproduction of a number of her paintings, at least 5 or 6, I think. And in the exhibition in 2016, we had a whole wall dedicated to San Antonio. She does people, she does landscapes, sort of architectural views like that one you saw. And what she was doing was recuperating. She was here for a short time from about February to June. And she was living with a friend named Leah, who she met in Canyon area. Leah was a good friend. She was also sort of a health inspector. She would drive. She was one of the women that helped O'Keeffe want to learn how to drive a car. She didn't drive a car in Canyon, but Leah was one of these women who were driving her car all around the Panhandle, inspecting for health management. And her uncle was O'Keeffe's doctor. She called him Dr. Mack. So they were close, the family was close, and she had a home here. Her name was Leah Harris. She had a home here in San Antonio or in the area. So for recuperation, Dr. Mack sent O'Keeffe on a train here to get well, and she essentially did. She started to get better. She didn't have Spanish flu, mind you. That didn't really hit until the fall of 18. But she was very sick, and a lot of her family members had died of tuberculosis, and she was always very afraid that she was going to get that. So it was a respiratory thing that she was fighting. She was getting better here. She was being social here. She learned a lot about San Antonio and how it's different than the Canyon area. So yes, that needs more work. That's a great question. So I challenge you to do that research and get that book
out. Most of the quotes that you have are from O'Keeffe to Stieglitz.
Yeah.
What was the relationship before they came?
So she began writing him basically as she was kind of traveling to Texas. She had found out that she got the job in Texas. She didn't want to stay teaching in South Carolina. She was unhappy in that job. She had to finish up a course in New York, and she got in touch with Stieglitz at that time and started writing to him. He was still married. They weren't officially an item at all, but I think they actually fell in love during these letters when she was writing from Canyon. So they were distant, long-distance relationship. She only saw him when she went back in 1917, June, to see the show, and he had just taken it down. She didn't tell him she didn't tell him that she was coming. She just showed up, and he was like, I just took your show down. So he rehung the whole thing for her. So I think they were, and what was interesting is she's falling in love with Ted, she's dating other people in Canyon, and at the same time she's writing all these love letters, and I mean, not obvious love letters, but at one point he even says something like, do you want to have my baby? And she says, I dropped the letter, I didn't know what to say, you know? So like, it's very obvious that they're starting a relationship, but he doesn't end his marriage with his wife until she moves back to New York, and then they got married by 1924. So yeah, scandalous, but O'Keeffe in this era, talk about being young, she was playing the field a little bit and having fun doing it and wasn't embarrassed. She was a very independent woman in many ways.
Did O'Keeffe exhibit in Texas during her Texas?
No, she did not exhibit in Texas. She was exhibiting only at 291 through Stieglitz.
And do you know how accessible these works would have been to her students and other people in Canada?
That is the question. Now, she showed them photographs that Stieglitz sent of her. Like after June 1917, he took some photographs of her, like of her hands and her face. Nothing nude yet, nothing scandalous. But I know she showed her students those, but she never wrote about showing her students her work. She showed her sisters, she showed people she lived with, maybe she showed the other faculty. So she was in conversation, kind of showing them informally, but she did not have a show of her work at the institution. Like, I have found no evidence of that. But the question too is, you know, there is, and I hate to bring it up, but it's part of the story here. So there was a series that was determined to be inauthentic. It was called the Canyon Suite. It was found, and they match, like the canyon with crows. There's another canyon with crows, watercolor, but it doesn't really look like her style. It's much sloppier. So one of the explanations could be that she was showing students in Canyon her pieces and then they were copying them. But the thing is the paper conservators that looked at those works said that they post-dated 1930. So just nothing adds up. So the thing is, what was she showing her students? We know she was showing her students some photographs, but her own works, I don't have evidence for it. That's a good question.
We've got one more question here.
Maybe you can hear me. Has any work, or do you know anything about any of her students? Did any of them pursue an artistic career or anything of that nature?
That's a great question. Now remember, what she was teaching wasn't like fine arts degree. She was teaching dress design, so fashion. Here's a woman that was like the most scandalously dressed woman in Canyon teaching fashion design. But what she would have her students do is draw the dresses, and she would have them model for each other in their dresses. There was no nude modeling going on. And she was teaching drawing. So it was more of a and she didn't have males in her classroom. It was only the females. So she was teaching them to be teachers. So none of them were training to be fine artists or studio artists. They were all going out into the public schools in the area and teaching, including drawing and penmanship. That was something that every teacher would have taught their students. So it was something in a kind of basic curriculum. So I don't know about any artists that emerged out of studying with O'Keeffe, but we do have lots of interviews from these women before they passed that were studying with her, and they talk about how she influenced their entire life to think about the way they put on their clothes or how they arranged their house, always think through design and think through aesthetics. But those women would be like artists that were producing fine art in Texas. I don't think that's true. That's a great question too. I hadn't thought about that. So the long lost O'Keeffe student that, you know, all of you dealers want to snap up. Sorry to disappoint, but I don't think it's there. Anything else? Okay, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.